Hey, welcome to the last part of the Portal walkthrough where we're going to turn this ugly ass image into a beautiful portal. And I'm not going to focus too much on the actual post-processing of like blurs because this is honestly just a lot of glow. But we're also going to look at how I created the actual location as the portal is looking and the fake lighting that I did to get some uh, illumination of the portal on our ground plane. So on our renderer 3D, you can see I've used the OpenGL renderer. I am outputting the RGBA channel, which is just the simple color channel, but I'm also putting out the object ID, which we are going to use right here. And we're going to output the vector channel, which is the velocity or the movement of our 3D animation. This is similar to the way we have calculated the velocity ourselves for our particles. Only that we can plug this in for our vector motion blur right here to get some motion blur. Because I've talked about this in a previous tutorial, there is this motion blur tab right here which you can use, but this iterative motion blur will kill your performance in most cases. This is fine for like 2D stuff, for adding motion blur to a mask, but for 3D this is usually killing your performance without having any benefit because it usually looks very ugly. This vector motion blur right here is also just a 2D motion blur. This can't produce any curved results, but in most cases this looks better and is faster than the iterative motion blur on our renderer 3D. So, okay, enough bashing of motion blur. Let's get into our color correction right here. First, what I did is I've taken a color corrector and simply increased gain and gamma a little bit. Here we also see why I've rendered out the object ID channel right here. Because on these settings, I'm going to limit the effect of our portal to our first object ID, which is this portal. I can disable this, and you can see that now I'm also affecting the particles, but I wanted to treat them differently. The reason I've used this instead of rendering this in different passes is simply because sometimes if you render this in different passes, you get the issue of edges, that the particles are not properly aligning to the edges and they are going above or beyond the actual image or the actual portal. And with the object ID, I could mostly remedy that while still keeping these color corrections separate. So yes, so first I increased the gain and gamma of our portal. Then I've used different values for our particles. And I've used the vector motion blur. The vector motion blur, as the name suggests, as I said before, is creating the motion blur. But I didn't just use the channel itself. Usually this is set to vector X and vector Y and using the inbuilt vectors. But because we have such a high velocity sometimes, and because of the high deformation of our portal right at the beginning, these values can get insanely high to the point that our image just is broken. And sometimes you have the issue that the motion blur suddenly goes from completely left to completely right because the velocity is so high. This is why I've taken the copy orgs right here to map the vector channel to our color channel, and then I've plugged that into a custom tool. And in the custom tool, I've used in the channel tabs, I've simply normalized the values of red and green, and I've multiplied them with our N1 slider. And this N1 slider is set to 50 and it's already and it's also animated. This is because the normalized values were too small, but I didn't have any outliers like a single pixel that suddenly has a very high velocity and is smearing from left to right. Yeah. And then I plugged that into the vector motion blur, changing this to red and green, and now I have this very good looking motion blur without any outliers or pixels that are destroying the whole look for a single frame or are flickering or whatever. In most cases, you don't need to do this, but in this case, it was necessary. Then, as I said before, we have two glows. These are not set to any object. They are simply here. The difference you get is by changing the threshold and the gain and glow size. And because we were able to change the luminance of our particles and our portal individually, we were able to, or we can really well change how our glow affects our image. Because if I'm going to disable this, now our particles aren't glowing at all. And now we can increase the glow without affecting the portal itself. Then, now we're going to merge the other side. With other side, I simply mean the other side of the portal, what we're seeing. And for that, I've simply used this Chinese Garden HDRI from HDRI Haven, which is a very, very, very good site. Be sure to check that out. And transformed this because we don't need the whole area. We're going to map this to a sphere, and we're going to use this as the material of a simple plane, where I've used an ellipse to cut out the portal shape. So if we look at this, we can see if we go from left to right, we can actually see the portal from the other side. And this is because we have this sphere map of our material or of our image. It's working pretty similar to the reflection shader that we've used right here. This is essentially the same. This is also a sphere map that, depending on just that we here have a little bit more of a refraction, and here we have just straight looking through this without any changes depending on the angle of the model. Then I'm using an instance transform, which is instance to this transform up. So this is on the same position as our portal. Then we are merging in our camera that I've created right here, and we're rendering the other side. Some quick color correction to make this pinkish to the same hue as our portal. And now we're going to merge this in. Next, we have a displace, and this displace is essentially the 2D version of this displace 3D that we have right here, only that it's working on an image. And again, we are also using a fast noise for the displacement. And this time I've used the not a square aspect ratio, but the same aspect ratio as our final render. And this is also an animated noise. And this is responsible for this fiery looking effect, I want to say, but you probably know what I mean. This is, without this is looking very uniformly, and now it's really looking like it's gone through space-time. The actual warp animation of our portal is also done in a 2D effect with a dent. So this is without it, this is with the dent, and I've simply used a cosine dent function, and I've animated the size and the strength. So on the first few frames, we simply animate this, and this is giving us this very nice warp animation right here. Next, our node branch is being split. And this is because now we're going to make the fake lighting that I've used. And this isn't a very reliable tip, I want to say. This worked for this kind of project, but Fusion doesn't really have ray traced lighting. It doesn't really have a good 3D lighting system in general. But we can use the rendered image that we have right here and create some form of illumination from our portal. For that, I simply added a blur to blur the image very strongly, use the soft glow, and I've plugged that into a projector 3D. The projector 3D can be used to project an image onto a 3D geometry. And in this case, we are simply projecting this onto a ground plane. This is really just a plane. I've used another ellipse to mask off the area because I wanted to have a starry background everywhere else and I didn't want just a black floor. So this is why this right here is plugged in to our plane. And this is really just a big ass plane chosen as a ground plane. And we are going to project the image of our portal to this ground plane. Then we are again adding in our camera and rendering this out. And this is the final image. And as you can see, because we are plugging in our portal, this does look like it's interactive light. It's not, but it looks like it, and that's all that matters. Then we are going to merge this on top of our starry background, which is just this image of the Milky Way, color corrected a little bit, mapped onto a sphere, which is, it's just a big sphere, which works pretty much like a dome light. Again, merging in our camera, rendering this, and putting the floor with the lighting on top of that. And then we're going to merge this with our portal. So this is right here. This is where our dent was. Then we branched this once to create the lighting and once to merge this on top of our lighting. And that's all. And this is the portal. Again, if you want to check out this file, you can buy the advanced pCustom examples that I did and get this very same project file. And there are also, of course, the free examples, and I also have a blog post where I've written about all these examples in detail. So if this was too fast for you, or you want to know more about the pCustom tools, I have a lot of more content about the pCustom tool in written form on my website. So I hope this was helpful to you, and have a great day.